Hello there, and welcome to the last lesson in Cells and Diffusion Part 2, Lesson 11, which is on diffusion. Okay, so this is the very last lesson in this booklet. Well done for getting it this far. And this is going to be quite a beefy lesson because diffusion is sometimes really hard to understand. So I'm going to try my best to give you as many visual aids as possible, but feel free to look at other websites and YouTube to see different videos on how to explain diffusion, okay? That being said, let's get started on the do now questions. So go ahead and pause the video and get started on these 8 questions, please. Perfect. So let's get through these as fast as possible. That way you're not too stuck on these ones, and I want to spend more time on the actual lesson itself. So number 1. Which microscope would you use to look at ribosomes? So ribosomes are extremely small, which means that we have to use electron microscopes. Okay, microscopes. And which microscope you can use to look at onion cells? So onion cells are plant cells, and for those plant cells, we don't really need anything more than a light microscope. Okay, and this is what we would have done if we had a practical or if we were actually in school. Number 3, state the stain that you can use to show up plant cell organelles. Again, this one we would have done this in a classroom, but we use iodine in the classroom for staining. Number 4, state the organelles only found in plant cells. So there were 3 organelles that are only found in plant cells, not animal cells, and the 3 are the chloroplast, the cell wall, and the permanent vacuole. And number 5 is going to be the other 5 that you can find, right? Only in animal, the 5 organelles that you find in animal cells, which are the nucleus, ribosome, mitochondria, cytoplasm, and cell membrane. Okay, no particular order at all. Number 6, state which organelle carries out protein synthesis. So make sure that you are revising the cell organelles and their functions, and this one is going to be ribosomes. Number 7, state which organelle releases energy in respiration. Energy refers to power, power refers to mitochondria. Okay. And last one, if the eyepiece is 10 times and the objective lens is 40 times, what is the total magnification? So total magnification, you just multiply the 2, which gives you 400 times. Okay, so please make sure that you have all the answers correct in your booklet, and let us move on to the bulk of the lesson here. Alright, so let's scroll down here, and we're going to start off with this big paragraph right here, and you can go ahead and highlight that bit right there, because that's going to be a very, very important part, but as the lesson is titled Diffusion, it's going to be everywhere in this lesson. So let's start off with a little bit of an example of what diffusion could be like. All right, so imagine that you're walking across the street one day and you notice a really, really nice smell from your favorite restaurant. Can be McDonald's, can be fish and chips, you know, whatever it is. But the thing is, you don't actually see it. You don't see a McDonald's anywhere around you. You don't see that fish and chip shop, but you can smell it. All right, you don't see it, but you know it's there. So how do you smell the food even though you are physically very far away from the actual food? Okay, so that is because of diffusion. All right, so let's kind of go into this. Plant and animal cells need basic raw materials in order to function. Makes sense. For example, they need oxygen and glucose, which is glucose is another term for sugar. And sugar, same way how we process sugar, sugar is energy. So that energy can be released in the process of respiration. Right? It's very important to know here that every cell in the plant needs oxygen and glucose in order to survive. So just know that glucose is actually a very, very important thing that every living organism needs. Okay, especially plants and animals. All right. Such substances need to enter the cell through the cell membrane. Now, with diffusion, the cell membrane plays a huge role because you know from earlier that the cell membrane controls what enters and leaves the cell. And some of these substances need to be small enough in order to get through the cell membrane. Okay, if it's too big, then it's just going to wreck. It's going to destroy the cell itself. So the cell is actually very selective in what gets to enter and what gets to leave. So most substances will pass through the membrane in a process called diffusion. And it's a very simple process. And here's that highlighted bit here. It is the gradual movement of particles from places where there are lots of them to places where there are fewer of them. And this might seem like a really confusing way to explain diffusion, but with lots of pictures and visuals, you're going to understand this. It's just the natural tendency of particles to spread out. Now, this part here, I do want to explain this natural tendency because this is a very important thing in science. So most particles in the world will diffuse because these particles that diffuse, they want to be in a state of like comfort. They want to be comfortable. So the way that I explain this is imagine that you're in a classroom with all the students from your year. All right? It could be comfortable depending on how big your classroom size is or how many of you there are. Okay, but let's imagine that we add in another year group. Okay, so let's add in all the year 8s, and then you add in all the year 9s, all the year 10s, and then the year 11s. So the more that you put into that one classroom, the more it's going to get crowded, right? And if you were in that classroom, I think it'd be safe to say that you're not very comfortable. So what the natural thing to do from there would be to spread out, right? For people to leave the classroom. And that's a natural thing to do. It's a natural tendency. And particles behave the exact same way, right? They want to be in a state where it's comfortable. They don't want to be uncomfortable, all right? So in that example that I just used, all the students would kind of be spreading out across the entire campus, right? To different classrooms, to different buildings, whatnot, right? And same thing with, if I use that same example with particles, okay? Particles don't all want to be in one cell. They want to spread out so that they're evenly distributed, so that they're not too crammed up in one space, all right? Okay, so obviously if we were in a classroom, then I would have an air freshener and I would spray it in one corner, and you'll notice that the smell of that air freshener will spread from one corner to the opposite corner. All right, and you'll notice it because students that are sitting close to that one corner that I sprayed it would smell it first, and then the student would gradually, going from that corner, more and more students would say, okay, I can smell it, I can smell it, I can smell it. And then the last student to smell it would be the student that's farthest away from the corner. Okay, so that's diffusion. So that's that gradual movement of particles. So the particles we're talking about here would be the air freshener particles, that nice smell. So it's that gradual movement of those particles from a place where there's lots of them, where I sprayed in the corner, to where there's fewer of them. All right? Okay, so this picture here, I don't really like it because it doesn't really do a very good job of explaining diffusion, but this is a visual representation of the air freshener particles. So the air freshener particles would be black and the air particles would be gray, and you'll notice that the black particles are all concentrated in one corner of the box, and then after a while, so the air represents as time moves on, the black particles are spread out to the entirety of the room. Okay? Okay. So this definition right here in yellow, okay, I've already pre-highlighted this because it's that important. So let me just read out this definition out for you. It says that diffusion is the spreading out of particles from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. So in order to understand this, you kind of need to understand what concentration is, right? Because if you didn't know what concentration is, then this definition doesn't really do much for you. High concentration means that the area that you're looking at is packed with molecules. Okay, you might have heard the term high concentrated before on like a juice box or ingredients, and it just means that there's a lot of that substance. Okay, very highly concentrated, right? Lots of it in one place. Whereas low concentration, that would mean that the area has not a lot of molecules in it. Okay, so low concentrated would be something that there's not a lot of it of. Okay? To give you an example, if I were to put salt in a glass of water, okay, then the amount of salt that I put in would determine if it's high concentration or low concentration. If I put, to 1 cup of water, if I put 3 tablespoons of salt, okay, and I dumped that in the cup of water and I mixed it around, if you took a drink of it, you'd probably think it came from the ocean. Okay, that's because you have a high concentration of salt water. And then compare that to a glass of tap water. Okay, that would be a low concentration of salt. Okay, in this sense, it'd be low to no concentration because you didn't put any salt in it. But nevertheless, it has a lower concentration of salt water than the glass with 3 spoonfuls of salt. Okay. Now the next part says that it takes place in liquids and gases because the particles in these states can move about randomly. This one I'm going to highlight in a different color just because it's kind of important in its own way. So the reason why this is important is because, as you know, the 3 states of matter are solid, liquids, and gases. And solids don't move around or fill up any container that they're in, but liquids and gases do. Right? If you have a container and you pour in a liquid into it, that liquid's going to take the shape of the container. Same as a gas. Even though you might not be able to see the gas, that gas will take the shape of its container. Okay? So diffusion only happens in liquids and gases because the molecules or the particles have to be free to move around. It won't work in solids because the molecules in solids are stuck together. Okay? So that being said, I'm going to show you a quick video right now that will show you a little bit about the actual molecules moving around in diffusion. Alright, so what I have here is just a simple video on diffusion, and what's happening is you have a glass of water, and what we're going to do to it is we're going to introduce a lump of sugar. Alright, and each individual lump of sugar, or sorry, a lump of sugar is made up of each individual piece or molecule of sugar, right? So you may have done this, or you might be able to do this in the future. But what we're going to do is when the molecules are in the sugar, okay, they're going to start dispersing because the water dissolves the sugar lump. And as it dissolves, the sugar molecules will start to spread out from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Okay, so when the lump of sugar first went into the water, the beaker, okay, all the sugar was in one spot. All right, and as time moves on, the sugar molecules will eventually dissolve in the water, and what that dissolving means is that the sugar molecules are diffusing to the parts of low concentration. Okay, so the important thing to know here is that try and use the examples that I give you. Okay, so for example, that lump of sugar where we started, okay, imagine this is the classroom where all the students are crammed into. Okay, and everywhere else is the campus, other buildings, other classrooms. And so as time moves on, okay, all the students crammed into that one classroom are going to want to spread out to different places. That's what it means to go from high concentration to low concentration. Okay? So there's that video for you. You can find this on YouTube. Okay, if you just type in diffusion, you'll see tons of videos on how to basically understand diffusion, how different people explain it. You might not understand it from the way I'm explaining it, so don't feel like you have to understand it the way I'm trying to explain it. Okay? The next part that you need to know about diffusion, all right, is there are different rates of diffusion. Okay? So there's 2 different things that we look at that affect the rate of diffusion. So if we're looking at rate, we're looking at the speed at which things will diffuse, because depending on these 2 factors, okay, it will actually change how fast or how slow molecules will diffuse. All right. So the first factor says the difference in concentration. Right. So this is called the concentration gradient. So if you have a paperback copy and you already have this highlighted, can you please underline concentration gradient? Because this is another term that you need to know. All right. So just like it says in the chart, concentration gradient is a shorter way of saying the difference in concentration. And when there's a difference in concentration, all right, we know that there's going to be a diffusion happening, because diffusion only happens when there's a difference in concentration, high concentration to low concentration. But when that difference is even bigger, all right, when you have a very big concentration gradient or a high concentration gradient, then the rate of diffusion will increase. Okay, I'm going to scroll down here because I want to fit in some annotations. So again, when you have a high concentration gradient or a very, very big difference in concentration, then the rate of diffusion will increase. You're going to have a fast rate of diffusion. So the opposite is true. If you have a low concentration gradient or not that big of a difference in concentration, then you're going to have a slow rate of diffusion. Okay? So that's one factor that will affect the rate of diffusion. The other one is a little bit easier to visualize and actually see, because you can actually see this happen. You can do this in your own home. All right? So the next factor is temperature. And it says that the higher the temperature, the faster that rate of diffusion, because the particles have more energy. And this is kind of a known fact in science, is that when you have high temperature, then generally things have a lot more energy. Okay? So the molecules that you're putting into there have a lot more energy than if it were cold. So going back to the same example that we use with the glass of water and the sugar molecules, right? If you had a cup of hot water, right, and a cup of cold water, and you put the same lump of sugar, same size lump of sugar in both of them, then the cup with hot water will actually diffuse much, much faster than the glass with cold water. Okay, you can try it at home if you want. Okay, and this is kind of the reason why we use hot water for tea, right? Because you want it to diffuse a lot faster, and obviously hot water allows things to diffuse much faster. Okay, so you can do this at home. I'm going to show you a quick clip on how temperature affects the rate of diffusion really quick here. Alright, so this video here you can find on YouTube. It's on the channel Learned Notebooks at the bottom here. Okay, and you can actually do this at home with a plate, some hot water and cold water, and some Skittles. Okay, so have a look through, and I'm going to explain it as we go along here. And that's just because I want you to understand what's going on. Okay, so here's what you need. You need some candies. Skittles works best. Ice water, hot water, and 2 plates. Doesn't have to be styrofoam. Okay, and what you're going to do is you're going to make indents. So what you can do is you can push down on the Skittles onto the plate, but you don't really need to do this on styrofoam. Like I said, you can just put them in corners. And what you're going to do is on one side of it, you're going to add hot water. Or sorry, in one plate you're going to add hot water, and on the other you're going to add cold water. Okay? And the purpose of this experiment is to figure out how fast the temperature can actually change the rate of diffusion. Okay? So it says, pause for discussion. What do you think is going to happen when the hot and cold water are added? Okay? And as I mentioned before, temperature does play a difference. Okay? Now notice how the plate on the left, okay, the color spreads out much, much faster than the plate on the right, right? And just so you know, this, as I mentioned on the video, this is sped up 6 times, okay? But I'm going to pause the video right here, but you notice how much of a difference there is in temperature, okay? And this is how diffusion happens when you have a difference in temperature. This is how much of a difference it can make. So imagine if you had, you know, say for example, boiling hot water and cold water. You'd probably see an even bigger difference, okay? All right, and so now that we've learned about diffusion, about what it is, how we can change its rate of diffusion and the speed, let's go back to the cell and explain why it's so important for the cell, okay? So dissolved substances that are small, like glucose and oxygen, can move into and out of cells by diffusion. Bigger molecules like starch and proteins cannot pass through cell membranes, and this is actually really important because you don't want you don't want that to be a very like thing to happen all the time. Okay, so this is very helpful for plants because there are some molecules that the cells do not want inside them, such as starch and proteins. So the cell membrane will do its job of being selective as to what can enter and what can leave the cell. All right. Particles move across the cell membrane where there's a high concentration, which is outside of the cell, to where there's a low concentration, which is inside the cell. All right. So overall, when you have a difference in concentration, you're going to find that the particles will move to wherever there's a low concentration. So take a look at this picture right here and notice how inside the cell there is a lot less of the molecules, right? But on the outside, there's a lot of them. So that cell membrane, okay, acts as kind of a barrier to keep the big molecules out, but the smaller molecules such as glucose and oxygen are free to move in and out, so that there's a lot of or there's an equal number of molecules on both sides of inside and outside the cells. All right. And in the human body, all right, diffusion takes place in lots of places. For example, in the lungs. When you breathe in, right, you're taking in oxygen. The oxygen will go into your mouth and your nostrils, and it will end up inside your lungs where there's this thing called air sacs. Okay, and your air sacs are lined with veins and arteries. Okay, so what will happen is oxygen will diffuse into your bloodstream. Okay, and carbon dioxide will diffuse out. So that's why when you breathe in, okay, you breathe in oxygen, you breathe out carbon dioxide, because your body or your lungs are exchanging that oxygen for carbon dioxide. All right, and the best thing about this, okay, I'm going to add this annotation at the very bottom here. The best thing about diffusion is that there's no energy involved. Okay, you don't actively need to use up energy. You don't get tired by breathing, right? So there's no energy that's needed to do diffusion. It's a no energy process. Okay, so for instance, like plants don't need to worry about if they have enough energy to, you know, suck up water and nutrients. It just does. That's kind of how the universe works. That being said, they do need that water there in order to diffuse, or in order for the water to diffuse into their roots. But that being said, they don't need their roots to go and pick up water. All right. Another example in the human body is the small intestine. So this is where most of your food and the water are absorbed into your blood. Okay, and you're gonna look more into this in the nutrition and digestion booklet. But your small intestines are actually, again, there are pieces, or there are structures in your small intestine called villi that help absorb food and water and glucose into your blood, where then it can be transported to different parts of your body where it needs that stuff. Okay? Okay. So before we get on to these knowledge questions, please make sure that you understand diffusion, because it is going to be one of those things that are very, very difficult to understand. I will try to put links in the description to other videos that you can watch, so that you're not left alone with just my video. If BBC Bite Size is always a good website to use if you wanted to look up more on diffusion. Okay, but that being said, get started on the knowledge question, 14 questions again, and you can pause the video right now. Okay, so let's start off. Again, these numbers represent the points that they're worth if it was on an assessment. Okay. So number 1, state the structures found only in plant cells. Okay, so these are the cell wall, chloroplast, and permanent vacuole. Number 2, state the structure where chemical reactions occur. This one is your cytoplasm. Okay. So my hope for you guys is that these organelles and functions come to you as second nature because you revise them so much. All right, that's kind of where this is where I want you to be at, so that on an assessment you're not wasting time remembering all these different organelles and their functions. Number 3, state the structure which controls what enters and leaves the cell. This is the cell membrane. Number 4, state the structure which contains chlorophyll. All right, that should be a dead giveaway to the organelle chloroplasts. Number 5, state the process, or suggest the name of the process by which many particles move. And this is what we've been talking about all day today, is diffusion. And number 6, state the names of 2 organelles that cannot be seen with a light microscope. So you can put ribosomes, and you can see, or sorry, you cannot see mitochondria. I'll accept that as well. You can even put cytoplasm. All right, and I wouldn't put chloroplasts on there just because they're not exactly, they are green, so you can actually see them quite well, just not in the detail that you would want with an electron microscope. Number 7, write the definition for diffusion. So you can take this straight from the area up top, but basically I'm going to write it out in ways that you can hopefully understand a bit better. Is spreading out of particles from high concentration to low concentration. So I'm hoping that you remember the phrase high concentration to low concentration, right? High concentration to low concentration is going to be actually a very, very common way that most things in the universe work. So it's good that you know that now, and that way you can kind of get a feel for how other things, when you go into higher science, you can kind of understand, well, that's kind of how everything else works, so it's kind of a trend. Okay. Number 8, suggest which structure, the cell wall or membrane, is most important for diffusion. So between the cell wall or the membrane, the cell membrane is actually going to be much more important because the cell wall doesn't really control what enters and leaves. That's more the membrane. The cell wall is more focused on making sure that the structure of the cell is intact, and it provides protection. Number 9, state 2 substances that need to enter the cell by diffusion. So from what we were talking about before, you can do oxygen and glucose. Okay. Number 10, state 2 factors that affect the rate of diffusion. So the easier one to understand is temperature, right? Because you should understand temperature. You should understand that temperature, because things are hot, they have more energy. Okay, and when things have more energy, they tend to move around more, and that will increase the rate of diffusion. The other one is called the difference in concentration, which is concentration gradient. All right. Number 11, explain how these factors affect the rate of diffusion. So let's just go with what makes it faster, or how can we make the rate of diffusion faster. So if you have high temperature and high concentration gradient, will increase the rate of diffusion. All right, so when you increase the rate, that means you're getting faster. And then the opposite would be true. So low temperature and low concentration gradient will slow the rate of diffusion. So just to make that easier, we'll make the rate of diffusion faster. Okay, that way we're on the same term there, same page. Number 12, state the name of 2 substances that cannot diffuse across the cell membrane. So you can use proteins and starch, because that gives you those examples in the booklet. And number 13 actually asks you to explain why they can't diffuse across the membrane. And the reason for that is that they are too big, right? So cell membrane is very selective in what goes through the membrane, and one of the biggest factors, or criteria I should say, is size. Okay. And the last one, suggest the name of a substance that would need to diffuse out of a cell, and that would be carbon dioxide, because when your mitochondria are working, they're taking in oxygen and they're putting out carbon dioxide as a product. Okay, same thing as how you need to breathe, your mitochondria needs to breathe as well to create energy. All right, and there you have it. That is the end of Cells in Diffusion Part 2, and you are done with the Cells in Diffusion booklets. So well done on that, and thank you so much for watching these videos.